This is Tom Nelson, and I'm very happy to have Douglas Pollock here from Chile. I first learned about Douglas's work when Christopher Monckton talked about it on my podcast earlier this week. So Douglas, can you take it away and just tell us a little bit about yourself before we get going?
Yes, Tom, nice to meet you. I'm a civil industrial engineer from the University of Chile, and I've been related to climate change and global warming since the year, I would say 2015 at least, for 7 years by now. And I've been studying in depth the scientific and the economics on climate change mostly, and attended a lot of conferences, mainly in Heartland, in the USA, in Spain also for COP25. And my purpose of doing this is to warn people, companies, politicians, governments about the dangers of the mitigation and adaptation measures that the UN and globalists are trying to force us to adopt around the Western nations, because this doesn't work in the Eastern nations. And that's it. And for the last, would say, 2.5 years, I've been working mainly exclusively in renewable generation and what takes place with what happens and try to prove what takes place with electricity costs and CO2 emissions.
So let's start by saying, what are the green arguments that claim that electricity prices must drop as well as CO2 emissions?
This is a graph that shows how the cost of electricity goes down, the blue line, while the renewable generation fraction goes up. This is the case for the Chilean generation between years 2012 and 2020. As you can say, immediately you can derive that because renewable generation goes up, then the cost of electricity must go down. Easy to believe that argument, isn't it?
Yeah,
now,
it is.
On the other hand, we have this other graph, this one here, very well known around the world, what takes place in Europe. There you have all the countries in Europe. While the renewable generation goes up, the electricity cost goes up. So this is absolutely strange. As you can see, one says it goes down and the other say it goes up. And the funny thing is, Tom, that both graphs are true. There's no lie in any one of the two. So what really takes place? And what it takes place is very funny also, because it's a game, it's a kind of a trick with logics that I would like to show to you. And we finally see that there's one element missing to fully understand what really takes place. And this is one of the arguments. You know that an argument is an ensemble of premises or assertions that lead to a conclusion. The premises may be true or false, as well as the conclusions may be true or false, deriving in that the argument will be as well valid or invalid. Here we got the first argument related with electricity price or electricity cost in a grid. Because the sun and the wind energies are free, then the electricity price must fall. As you can see, the sun and wind, that is true. They are free. The other one, investment costs have dropped for the last 10 years. That is also true. Two true premises that lead to a conclusion that electricity price must fall. And we prove that there's no relationship of causation and effect between the argument, the premises and the conclusions. And we prove that this is false, so the argument is invalid. On the other hand, we have this other argument on CO2 emissions. Because the sun and wind don't burn fossils. That is true. Then the electricity price must fall. And on the other hand, CO2 emissions must also fall. Again, a true premise, but we will prove that the conclusions are false, making the second argument also invalid. And what happens? Why does this happen with true premises that reach to false conclusions? Because we have a general structure of electricity cost, a general electricity cost structure that we can show it very simply in this plot here, in this graph. In the upper part, you have the thermal, technical, and cost variables that lead to thermal cost of electricity, what the EIA, the North American EIA, named levelized cost of electricity. Okay, in the right hand, you have renewable technical cost variables that lead to renewable cost of electricity, both leading separately to the grid cost of electricity. Now, if you analyze the cost of a grid this way, you can get to the conclusions you got before, previously. Okay?
Yeah.
But there's a big element they miss. They don't tell us what really happens is this. There's a relationship between the renewable generation and the thermal generation. When you increase the renewable generation, that will affect the efficiency and the performance of the thermal generation because of the need to back up the renewable generation. What do you have to do when the wind goes away or the sun sets? You must have at all times an available thermal source ready to ramp up to replace the lack of renewable generation. And that is why the renewable generation will always force the thermal generation to a fraction of it to work inefficiently.
Okay.
And that is a source of all what I will show next.
Very good. Makes sense.
So we then go to, we here in this graph, we see what takes place really. The green line is the renewable cost of electricity in megawatt in dollars per megawatt hour. Okay, that is constant because as you increase the renewable generation in a grid, it also increases the renewable installed capacity, making all its costs. Which are those costs? The investment cost, the capital cost, the operations and maintenance costs, the transmission costs. They all, the rate of those costs remain constant as the renewable generation increases. And what takes place with the thermal source, in this case, the red line, they all increase in dollars per megawatt hour. Why do they increase? Because as you shrink the thermal generation source so that the demand will always, the sum of both generation will always be constant equal to the demand. You can't play with that. At all times, the sum of all generation must be a constant. Then the unit cost will rise. Why? Because you start shrinking the thermal generation and all its costs will be distributed in a lessened amount of generation. So the capital cost goes up, the transmission operations and maintenance cost goes up, as well as the fuel cost. Why the fuel cost? Because you force the thermal source to operate with ramp ups and downs because the natural intermittency is coming from the renewable source. Understand? And all those increase until a limit. And what is that limit in the vertical black line there is called the maximum renewable generation fraction in a grid. There's a limit, a well-defined limit that we discovered, no one else has done before, and we call it the FR max. It's a maximum generation that electrical grid can bear. Above that, thermal cost remains constant because you can't reduce any longer the generation fraction, the thermal generation fraction. And above that limit, all renewable generation above that limit will be necessarily lost. And you can continue to increase the renewable installed capacity and all that new generation will be lost. So the cost from then on of the renewable source will increase. And the dotted black line there is the grid electricity cost that always rises, always rises.
Interesting.
Now, I can show this more in detail. At the left, we defined inefficiency factor called K, and the even point for K is 2. When you have that inefficiency factor coming from the natural intermittencies of the renewable source, here I show the weighted costs of electricity from the renewable and the thermal source. The renewable source in the green line again is the weighted cost for the renewable source. That is the cost of the renewable source multiplied by its share in the grid. It's very simple, as well as the thermal weighted cost is the thermal generation fraction multiplied by its cost. If you add both, you have the black line up there
Mm-hmm.
going always up. So what takes place here, and this is the most important part, you have two different scenarios that will be derived from the efficiency level of a grid. I will explain that later. If you have a K factor lower than 2, that means an efficient grid, that means that when you increase the renewable generation, you must decrease the thermal generation. So at all times, you will keep the sum of both equal to the demand. You can't play with that, as I told you before. Okay, so the thermal generation goes down, the renewable goes up, and what takes place with the costs can go slightly down, but insufficient to make the grid cost of electricity to go down. Because from the beginning, you start adding the renewable cost into the grid electricity cost. You understand? Now, in the graph of the right, you have the situation where K is greater than 2. That means a normal grid that most of the world have. And the grid cost of electricity will go even up more quickly. That's more or less the situation.
What form of thermal generation is best at ramping up and down quickly? I've heard natural gas is one of the better ones at quickly ramping up when the wind dies down.
That's one of the most important questions, Tom, because
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
in fact, you have two main sources of natural gas power plants, the combined cycle and simple cycle. The best by far is a combined cycle. And after those, you can also use oil, but nobody uses oil because it's expensive,
Okay.
and emits more than twice as natural gas. It's
Okay.
pretty much like coal. Okay, so between using coal or using oil, I prefer 1,000 times more to use coal instead of oil. So in the case of the United States for 2019, you only used 0.6% of the entire generation coming from oil. Nobody used this.
Okay.
And unless it's in emergency situations.
Okay. All right. And then coal is, you said it is hard to ramp up and down quickly with a coal plant as the wind dies down and comes up. It's quite inefficient to make it ramp up and down.
That is one of the elements. You can't do that. It will take you hours. It's a bit more complex to understand coal generation power plants. You actually, in theory, you can, but it takes you a lot of time because you can have the full heat capacity working, but not generating electricity. And if you want to ramp up having the boilers and the full heat capacity working or burning coal while not generating, and you want to ramp up suddenly, at every second you must synchronize the frequency from the generator with the frequency of the grid. In your case, you use 50 hertz, no, 60 hertz. We use 50.
Okay.
So that takes hours. So when you finally come to the level that the grid needs from the co-generator, maybe the wind is back again and the sun is rising again. It's too late.
Okay.
Now, you can have the heat at the top, but you will be wasting heat and coal just for nothing. Just for the hell of it. You understand? So that is why to back up renewables, you can only use combined cycle or simple cycle power gas turbines, or made in the two different ways, turbines and diesel engines.
Okay. Just a layman's question here. If you already had an area that is, let's say it's a large city area that's got a nice functional coal-powered electricity plant, does it make any sense to even add wind at all? Or should you just power your city with your coal plant, which you always know it's going to be running? It seems like you should just use the coal plant, shouldn't you?
Yeah, what a good question, Tom. No, always, renewable generation, wind and solar are a dead weight to any grid. Anyway, if you want to choose between having renewables or coal for a city, you should choose coal. And to the peak demand, let's say in the afternoons, then when it goes down in the night, and then when it goes up again in the mornings. Those are called peakers or shavers. Then you use natural gas for
Okay.
peak generation. And for the base load generation, in this case, coal or nuclear or hydroelectricity, you use them for base load during the day. That is a minimum generation that will be working all the day at maximum load capacity or maximum efficiency. That's the definition of base load generation. And coal is used for that purpose,
Okay.
as well as gas. But it happens that gas is much more expensive than coal.
Okay.
Yet it emits less than half of CO2 than coal.
Okay. But if this is a different question, but if CO2 is not the climate control knob, then I don't think we should get all worked up about whether we're emitting CO2 or not. We talked about using coal to ramp that up and down and gas ramping that up and down. But how about nuclear power stations? Can they ramp up and down quickly? Or hydro? I don't know if that, can you let more water go through the dam or less? And you can change that?
Yeah, in a dam hydroelectric stations, you can do that. Not in run-of-river. Run-of-river is used for base load as well as nuclear. Nuclear and coal, they're used for base load, but you can play around with hydroelectric dams.
Okay.
You can go up and down very quickly, the same as gas turbines.
One other question is, if there's some
real sunny place,
let's call it Tucson, Arizona, does it make sense at all when you have that much solar power to have any solar power in your grid? Or should you, does solar power not even make sense there for grid power in a real sunny place?
Well, no, it doesn't make sense, because in places like Arizona, I don't know specifically the case of Arizona, but I know a bit better the case of California. They must be more or less the same. You got deserts there, you got a lot of sun, but what takes place in those places is that you pass the limit of the maximum renewable capacity that any grid can support. So you have an excess of generation that would be lost.
Okay.
And again, when the sun sets, you must ramp up your other sources of generation, including coal. You also use coal. I will show you next in a slide I have that you also use coal to back up renewables in a very small amount, of course, because you can't go up and down. The thing is that when the grid requires electricity or availability of generation, they ask, who has electricity in this moment I need? And the coal power plant may say, hey, I got some right now. Well, give it to me. But this is a very, very few cases that in general you use gas turbines to back up the lack of renewables. And why you may ask yourself, Tom, why do grids always prefer renewables over thermal generation?
Why do they?
That's a very important question that needs to be answered, because there's a concept in the generation industry that is called the merit order, by which at all times the grid will choose the generation source that in that moment exhibits the least marginal cost or the variable cost. And which is the variable cost? The fuel cost. So imagine two sources of generation, a wind farm and a gas turbine. In that moment, the grid asks, who has electricity available? Both will raise their hands. The wind farm will be chosen first because the fuel cost of the wind is zero compared to the fuel cost of the thermal source. You understand?
Okay. I do,
That is why thermal sources are always preferred in the second place. First come in having electricity, first come into the grid, the renewable sources, wind and solar.
Okay. Yeah, so I hope you don't mind if I just keep peppering you with questions. I think this is good, actually, if you're okay with this. So if you were in charge of running the electrical grid in the UK, for example, it sounds like they're having terrible problems. Maybe 3/4 of the pubs are going to have to close down this winter. If you were in charge of running their grid, what would you do in terms of how would you supply their electricity? What percent of coal, et cetera? And would you have any wind or solar in there?
No, Tom, this is a political issue. Okay. I would have to belong to to a political party, something like that. But what would I do if I had the power to do so?
Yes. Yeah.
Necessarily before going into a chaos, a crisis
Yes.
that most probably, most likely, the entire Europe, except perhaps Hungary,
Okay.
but Poland and Czech Republic, they will be safe by now. But the rest of Europe will go down in a crisis.
Mhm.
Everybody knows it.
Yes.
Well, if I had the opportunity to do something, I would do something very illegal. I would.
Okay.
That is why I couldn't do it if I had the power, because you can't violate the merit order in the first place. What President of Mexico did a year ago, he violated the merit order and said, no longer any new renewable sources will come into the Mexican grid. And he just violated. And there are contracts in between that has to comply. He just throw them away and let the gas, the oil, and every other source of thermal generation come into the grid. Well, that's illegal. That's playing, how do you say in English? It's playing, making a trap. Okay.
But I mean, why?
Anyway, the problem in Europe in general is that they have already run out of time, because it's not just as Germany is trying to do that, bring back all the cogeneration power plants just like this. In many cases, you need many months
Yeah.
to restore them and put them in operations again. It's not saying, hey, come on, here again, you're close. No, it's not so simple. Imagine that, take into account also, Tom, that countries like Germany have been dismantling their nuclear power to replace them by renewables.
Okay.
How do you bring back a nuclear plant? They run out of time. I don't know what they're going to do. And besides, they don't have a stock of gas, nor they have coal. Russia just cut by half the supply of gas to Europe. I don't know what they're going to do.
Do you think so? Maybe this winter is going to be very tough. Do they have enough time by next winter? If you give them a year, can they get stuff online by then? Or
well, if politicians realize what is taking place there, perhaps next year they will be more prepared. But for this winter, I think they're quite late.
Yeah.
Germany announced a couple of weeks ago, announced that by this winter, from August through December, they will have a fair hike in electricity of 320%.
Okay.
In 5 months. Oh my God.
Yeah, I don't know what that's going to do to businesses. I want to get back to Mexico, though. You said that what they did was illegal. Why is that illegal? Or how did that law get made? Or why is it illegal?
Because you have contracts.
Okay. All right.
You invest in a country, you invest in a power station with a contract with the government or the laws in that moment, and you can't just violate them.
Okay.
That is why it's not so simple to say, I don't like wind and solar, so go away. Well, wait a moment. This is illegal.
Okay. So let's say I'm here in Minnesota. I think they might have a 20% mandate for, I don't know what, wind or solar. You're talking about some sort of agreement like that, where you can't just say, I don't like wind and solar in Minnesota anymore, and we can't just get rid of it because of laws like that, right? Because of the mandates that are already in place.
Yes. In that case, if you want to respect the contracts and the laws and regulations and do everything in a honest manner, to put it some way, you should put more gas turbines, combined cycle, which the United States have a lot, yet insufficient to support and to bear the tremendous amount of renewable generation you have, or generation capacity you have.
Okay. So basically,
I would do that meanwhile. And what I would start doing right now in any country in the world, in the Western nations, is to cut subsidies. Okay. And another measure that could be very, very quickly, very fast to do, is to re-adequate the calculation of electricity cost, assigning to the renewable cost of electricity all the thermal backup generation needed for the renewable generation to dispatch electricity into any grid. Today, that is not done anywhere in the world. If you add that other cost that in the absence of renewable wouldn't exist, then you finish the renewable business all over the world.
Okay, so it might be possible to more fairly allocate those costs without violating any laws. Do you think there is a way to do that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's an issue country by country. I couldn't
Yeah.
tell you that, Tom. And in your
Okay.
case, it would be a problem of state by state.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
couldn't say, but I could say technically or economically, if you assign that existing cost of backup of thermal sources to support renewables, if you add the cost and assign them to renewables, and not to the thermal source, because otherwise they wouldn't exist, then the game is over for renewables. It's so
Okay.
simple as that. But that is technical analysis, not a
Right.
political analysis.
Okay.
You understand the difference?
Absolutely. Okay. I just want to get your answer here as an expert that there are people here in the US that are saying, why don't we just go 100% wind and solar? All we have to do is cover an area, I don't know how many square miles they would take, and we can run the whole country. Maybe we can distribute those solar farms around so it's always sunny someplace. Or maybe we can run a cable that's 2,000 miles long to a. Do you know off the top of your head how much the losses would be in trying to run a cable from, let's say, Africa to London from a solar farm?
Forget it. You won't be able to light a bulb in the other side.
Okay.
No, you have a tremendous loss of energy with the distance.
There's an actual plan to do that, though, isn't there? A big solar farm in Africa and run it to. I thought it was.
Yes. And President Piñera also wanted to do that with Singapore and put a cable and a submarine cable from Chile to the other side of the world in Singapore in order to lighten up the nights when we have sun here in the desert.
Yeah. So that's completely insane, isn't it?
Absolutely insane.
Okay. And then people say, why don't we just buy a whole bunch of power walls from Elon Musk, and then we can just back up. We can have our solar power at night when we want it. But doesn't that take trillions and trillions of dollars worth of power walls? And we don't even have enough lithium.
Well, let me put it with just one simple number. If you would like to back up the entire US generation for 2 days, you will have to make all the factories of iron lithium batteries working 24 hours a day, 355 days a year for 1,000 years.
Really?
To back up only 2 days of the US generation. So imagine the cost.
Wow. Okay.
There are no materials, there are no factories, there's no money for that nonsense. Impossible.
Okay. So what do you think in California of this idea that we're not going to sell any more fossil fueled cars after, I don't know if it's 2035, we're going to charge everything's going to be an EV. How is the California grid going to handle that?
Well, first of all, you must enhance and increase your electricity generation, the same as you are doing for the normal use of electricity, this time for cars. Now, what takes place with the batteries or lithium batteries or these Tesla cars is that depending on the kind of grid you have, you increase CO2 emissions with electric vehicles. You don't reduce CO2 emissions compared with the situation of burning fuel in an internal combustion engine.
Okay.
You may very well increase in a normal grid around the world, you will increase emissions. Those grids based on coal, gas, and in a smaller amount, oil. If you only have hydroelectricity in a grid and nuclear, then you would see a savings no, all the contrary. If you are very intensive use of coal and gas, then you could probably have some savings, but very little in electric cars. Why this is because they never show you upstream emissions of electric cars. They don't show you the mining, they don't show you the manufacturing of these batteries and the amount of CO2 they emit. If you add that to the lifespan of a battery, you may very well increase CO2 emissions compared to an internal combustion engine.
Okay. All right. So it's not very efficient to burn coal in a coal plant and run it through a transmission line and eventually charge somebody's car and run the car on the battery energy. It's more efficient probably just to burn the gas right in the car and drive the car around.
Of course.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
green hydrogen. Yeah,
yeah.
by all means.
I'm sorry if I derailed you there, but those are great for me to hear those answers. I love those answers. Why do green supporters claim that electricity prices must drop because of a decrease in renewable investment costs?
Yeah, I call it the green trick.
Okay.
And I will go more in depth here, Tom, because it's very important to understand what takes place. The investment cost is one variable that does not go into the levelized cost of electricity. It's the one that goes into the cost variables. Electricity cost is the capital cost. And
Okay.
I will explain the difference between the two of them. The capital cost is related with the interest rate, with the project lifetime, and the investment cost as well. It uses units of dollars per megawatt hour or dollars per unit of energy,
Okay.
while the investment cost is the cost itself of an installed capacity in dollars per megawatt or dollars per unit of power, not energy. They're different variables.
Okay.
And the investment cost does not belong to the structure of a levelized cost of electricity. So, having said that, the capital cost is proportional to the investment cost. That is true. But the capital cost is inversely proportional to the capacity factor of a generation source. And in the case of a renewable source, the capacity factor is always much lower to the capacity factor of a thermal source, between 2, 3, 4, 5, even 6 times lower. So I will explain this with a very simple graph. We got just two lines. In the horizontal axis, we have the investment cost, the times the investment cost of the renewable source is greater than the investment cost of thermal source. For instance, in the middle, you have the number 1, okay? That means that at that point, the investment cost of a renewable generation source is the same as that of thermal source, okay? To the left, you increase, to the right, you decrease. It's upside down, this graph. And in the vertical axis, you have the same analysis with the capital cost. How many times greater is the renewable capital cost greater than the thermal capital cost? Now, if you have the investment cost of a renewable source equal to that of a thermal source, number 1 in the horizontal axis, for instance, $800,000 per megawatt installed capacity of a coal power plant equals $800,000 of our solar panel power plant, okay?
Okay.
So the ratio will be 1. In that case, you will still have that the capital cost of the renewable source will be almost, in this case, 2.83 with the parameters that we established before. You will have almost 3 times greater the capital cost of the renewable source than that of the thermal source. And that variable, the capital cost, is included in the cost of electricity. You see?
I do. Yeah.
So we can have the same. And so the advocates of renewables, they always say the cost of electricity must drop because investment costs for the last 10 years have been declining. That is true. But and so what? That has nothing to do with the capital cost, because still the capacity factor of the renewable source will be much lower than that of let's say a combined cycle power plant that can exhibit an 85% or 90% of capacity factor against 15%, 19% in the case of Ivanpah, 13% of the case of Crescent Dunes in Nevada, etc., etc., or 20% or 30%, whatever you want. You see, that is why this is a lie. This is misleading, what they claim.
If costs rise as the renewable generation share escalates, CO2 emissions should drop?
Well, that's a bit more complicated because not directly. You can have savings in CO2 emissions, but only in the most ideal grids. What do I mean with ideal grid or most efficient grids that not even the United States have? Perhaps you could find them in places like Finland or perhaps Norway and even Brazil, perhaps, because they are very intensive in hydroelectricity, but nowhere else. An ideal grid is that the one that you will only use combined cycle gas turbines to back up renewable generation. Only that. If you use any other source of generation, thermal generation to back up renewables, you will increase what in generation is called the operating heat rate and or the CO2 output emission rate because you're working with more inefficient sources of generation, which is a case of simple combined gas turbines.
Okay.
So if you use, I will show you next in this graph, if you use a very efficient source of backup, you may have some kind of reduction or CO2 abatement. In the left graph, you can see the capital E means emissions of CO2 and the small e is output emission rate, okay? So in the left graph, you have as the renewable share increases, inevitably the output emission rate will increase, okay? Because the ramp ups and downs and you force the thermal source to work and to operate in an efficient manner. So the unit emission rate or the output emission rate of CO2 will increase. But while the output emission rate increases, the thermal generation goes down. While one goes up, the other one must go down in order to keep at all times the demand equals to the sum of all the generations, okay? So if renewable goes up, the other one must go down. And which commands? Well, in the case of a very efficient grid, you may drop the CO2, the total CO2 emissions in the grid by the red line shown there in the left by very little, in this case 12%, but only compared to the total emissions considering only the sum of the renewable generation plus the natural gas generation.
Okay.
Only those, leaving outside all the other sources for generation like oil and coal and the others like geothermal, biomass, hydroelectricity, and nuclear. Okay?
Okay.
Only with that, you can have, in this case, about 15% of at the top, at the limit, at most. Okay? Now, that is in an efficient grid with factor K equal to 1.5 in this case. And let's see what happens in a normal grid around the world with a K factor of 2.5. Well, in that case, as in the other graph, the CO2 output emission rate will go up, but the total emission will also go up because it will not be able, the reduction in thermal generation is not able to offset the inefficiency of operating thermal source with other sources of generation like oil or simple combined gas turbines. You see?
Yes.
And that is the case in most grids in the world. Now, in the case of the United States, if you want to know what takes place there, oh, here I got a very funny graph. I showed you this graph at the beginning.
Yes.
That the cost of electricity goes down as the renewable generation fraction goes up.
Yes.
Well, this is absolutely misleading because why did, in the case of the Chilean grid between 2012 and 2020, go down? Not because renewable went up, but because the cost of the fuel came down. And there you have the correlation. That is why. And the Greens and green supporters or renewable supporters, they only show this one. This is a true graph, but it's misleading. It's intentionally misleading. And that is the reason why. Now, here you have the results for the 2019 generation in the United States. As you can see there, we have the factor K or an efficiency factor. It's below 2.
Okay.
But slightly below. So you can have, and this is calculated through the method of CO2 output emission rate and using the two big sources of information, you have the EPA and the EIA. Okay. Now, in this case, for the entire year 2019, you had only a drop in 7.7 million tons of CO2. That is nothing. That is 0.42% between points, depending on the source of information, between 0.42 and 0.47% of CO2 emissions abatement. That is nothing for the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars you have wasted to save the planet. Now, that is with respect to the grid. Now, with respect to the United States, it's 0.15, and with respect to the world emissions for that year, 0.02%. Thus, the United States, the second CO2 emitter in the world, have saved the planet by reducing its CO2 emissions by 0.02%. And you're almost bankrupt.
Incredible.
But then, Tom, we have another interesting method of calculating this, both valid, and I will tell you why it's different. This is the optimistic result. But if we do the calculations using the operating heat rate of both sources of generation, of the sources of generation, in this case, gas turbines, the entire gas generation in the United States, you got an entire different result. You have that the inefficiency factor K is greater than 2. And in that case, you have an increase in CO2 of 15.6, between 15.6 or 8.7 million tons of CO2 emissions, more than in the situation without having renewable. Meaning that you have an increase of 0.8, between 0.8 and 0.5% of CO2 emissions, compared with the situation or the scenario without having them. And in the world, you contribute to global warming. Very little, but you contribute to warm the planet. Well, why the difference between the two sources of generation? I can't judge that because, the two sources of information. I will not judge that because I don't know which is more reliable source of information. Is it the EPA or the EIA? I can't say that. I only show both sources of information.
Okay, very interesting.
And now we can have some conclusions about all this. Well, adding renewables into a grid makes the cost of electricity to inevitably increase, even in the feasible case where the investment cost of the renewable source is zero. If I'm the government, Tom, I tell you, look, I give you a subsidy that the investment cost for you in solar panels will be zero. You just place them in wherever you want. I give you the land, I give you the panels, I give you Chinese panels, and you just sit there in your couch and start earning money because the only thing you have to do is to plug it into a grid and start earning money. Even in that case, the cost of electricity will rise.
Interesting. Yeah.
In the second place, CO2 emissions, I explained this in depth, increase in a realistic operational scenario. Net zero emissions is an utopia. It's impossible because you know that you have a limit for renewables, above which all the renewable generation on top of that limit will be necessarily lost. So you can't, from that limit on, you can't continue to reduce the thermal generation if you want to have available and stable electricity. If you want to have sometimes weather-dependent electricity, well, then yes. Well, false statement is by every megawatt of renewable generation, slightly over a ton of CO2, 1.1, something like that, emissions would be forestalled from coal-fired generation. That's a lie. That's a lie. In the case of the United States, it's about the 50th of that. It's very, very, very small. If you reduce CO2 emissions, you can't compare it to replacing a coal-fired power plant directly. That is absolutely misleading. And finally, the great mistake of the West is the asymmetric renewable growth by dismantling and replacing thermal power plants by renewables instead of expanding thermal generation sources. This is very simple to understand. Imagine you have a coal capacity of 100 megawatts, and you want to phase out 20 megawatts. Throw it away. What is the West doing? is throwing away those 20 megawatts and replacing them with 20 megawatts of renewable generation capacity. That is a big mistake. If you want to do that, okay, take away those 20 megawatts of coal generation capacity. Install your 30 megawatts of renewable capacity, and then install 20 megawatts of combined cycle gas turbines. That is the correct way of doing it. No one is doing that. And they're eating their reserves in their security margins. And many places in Europe, as well as in, well, you had this in Texas last year, they're eating their security generation capacity that was meant to be there for other purposes, not to back up renewables.
Yes.
And you will run out of electricity. I don't know, some places in the United States, because I don't think this will happen again in Texas, but you will see probably more frequently in places like Oregon, Washington, California, New York, etc. And of course in Europe. In Australia, it's more every day, every time it's more frequent.
Do you happen to know what they're doing in Texas to make sure this doesn't happen again? I haven't really heard if are they building new actual power plants, or what are they doing to protect themselves in the future?
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't have any news about that. I
Okay.
know what happened in detail February last year, and it was 400 dead.
Yes, yeah, very
400
serious.
people died there. It was very, very serious, because what takes place with cold waves as well as heat waves, that they usually come with high pressure systems.
Okay.
And the first thing to go away is the wind. When you have high pressure, the wind goes away. And that can happen for days, even more than a week. In the case of the southern part of Australia, that happened 3 times in 6 months between 2018 and 2019, between September and March. 3 times, sometimes for 10 days. And what happens when you have a blackout for so many days? There's no battery that will resist that amount of time in the first place, and you run an entire city without electricity. You don't have any more transportation, because how do you fill up your tank?
Right.
With electricity from the wells, okay? You run out of fuel. You don't have electricity in the hospitals. In the case of Adelaide in Australia, they return the sick people to their homes. They can't be operated in emergency cases. It's a mess. The food started to get rot. So at the 5th day, people start dying. That is the big issue with big electricity blackouts.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just amazed that all of these real world problems are being caused because we're trying to prevent CO2 induced bad weather, which is not an actual thing. It's pretty amazing.
That's right. Just to suggest to your viewers, if they want to have a very big picture of climate change and the truth behind climate change and this theory of the UN about global warming, they can read a short article that's called the World Climate Declaration, titled "There's No Climate Emergency." There you have the website. It's very easy to access, clinton.org, and it's written in I believe, more than 10 different languages.
Okay.
So if you have German viewers, French viewers, or Swedish viewers, they're all translated into their respective languages.
Okay. Very, very good. All right.
Yes.
Where else can we find your work on the internet? Do you have a website, or are you active on social media at all?
No. I'm absolute enemy of social media. I don't use or have Twitter, Facebook, and all that. Nothing of that. I have a lot, tens or hundreds of interviews, and in internet it's very easy to Google me or watch me on YouTube. Most of them are made in Spanish, of course. But that is a way I've been known by the people. The only interest I have is to reach the people. Yes. I tried to reach the government when we supposedly had a rightist government in 2018.
Okay.
I wrote an article to the president, supported by 8 scientists around the world, from the UK, the United States, even from Taiwan, from Norway, from Germany, many places, eight scientists. And I sent it to the president with copies to four of his ministers. He never said, I received it, thank you, we will call you, nothing.
Okay. All right.
It was empty words. So imagine that with a rightist government. Imagine what can be any effort coming from me with communist government like this one. No
Okay.
chance. No
Okay.
chance.
All right. All right.
So my efforts are trying to get to the people and companies mostly.
Okay. All right. Well, I can see why Christopher Monckton had so many nice things to say about you on my podcast. This has been very good stuff. I think Al Gore's saying that the cost of solar power has dropped by 90%. I'm hearing numbers like that. Is there any reality behind any claim like that? Yeah.
The figures I manage are in the last decades, solar panels have dropped about, in average, about 78%,
Okay.
and onshore wind turbines about 55%. You know, Al Gore always exaggerates everything.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, he turns 90% into 100%, and
Yeah.
it's very easy for him to exaggerate everything. Now,
Okay.
those are the figures I use, I have read about. But
Okay.
anyway, it's tremendous amount of cost reduction. But again, it's a reduction in the investment cost, not in the capital cost,
Okay.
as I showed before.
Okay.
There's a very big difference. So it doesn't matter. So what? They can reach
Yes.
almost zero, and
Yeah.
still you will have a capital cost of the renewable source, generation source, many times higher than that of the capital cost of a thermal source, whatever the
Okay.
reduction in investment cost you may get. Even Al Gore has said that some solar facilities are cheaper than a coal power
Yes,
plant
I've
by
heard that.
megawatt. Yeah, so what? The capital cost will still be 3 times greater than that of the thermal source.
Yes. Good point.
The cost will still increase anyway.
Okay. Do you have any crystal ball where you can look into the future and see, like, there's so many wind turbines in Iowa, wind turbine farms there. Do you think in 50 years those turbines are going to be still maintained, or are they even going to be there? Do you think they're going to rust in place? What's going to happen to them?
No, I don't have a crystal ball,
Yeah.
and I don't like to use them even if I had one. I'm not very friendly of predictions because I was vaccinated by the UN and its models, so I don't like them.
Okay. Okay.
I understand. But what I can see, this is very realistic. There will be a break-even point. There will be a cap, a limit, where this renewables that today they're decreasing their costs, there will be turned back, and there will be start to be very expensive because we don't have all the neodymium or rare earth and cobalt and copper and lithium to build what the world want to build from now until 2050.
Okay. All right.
So this will have in some moment we'll have a backlash in this, and
Okay.
the cost of electricity will rise. If they're rising so badly now, imagine what can take place in the near future.
Okay. All right.
And when you leave people, the poorest, without electricity, well, riots, civil wars start to happen.
Okay.
You had 5 years ago or 4 years ago, you had the yellow vests in France. Everybody forgot that. You remember?
I do remember. Yeah, I do. Yeah. I think I know the answer to this, but I thought I would ask you this too. Is there any place in the world where there is a modern hospital or factory or city that is run by 100% wind and solar panels?
Impossible.
Yeah.
Please name me one.
I can't name one. So it doesn't seem like we should try to roll it out for the entire United States before we can like power just one factory that way. It seems like we should, which we can't. So anyway, I'd like to see it working on a small scale before we try to roll it out huge.
No,
yeah.
You cannot control the weather.
Yes. Yeah. Another question. I live here in Minnesota where we're above the 45 degrees of latitude. So the sun in the winter is at a pretty low angle. And solar makes even less sense here, I would say, than it does closer to the equator. We've got some sort of incentives now where my dad's on his farm and the neighbors are thinking of, let's cut down all the trees, cut down these nice forests, and put up solar panels instead. I think that is incredibly crazy. And I would guess you probably agree with that. Makes no sense in any way to do that.
Look, there are two investigations on this issue, very interesting. One was made for Germany and Switzerland, and in the United States, it was extended to the entire world. What happens is the following for you to tell your friends.
Mhm.
Above 35 degrees of latitude, north or south, the amount of energy you need for a solar panel to be built, manufactured, mined, etc., is greater than the total amount of energy that solar panel will produce through 25 years of lifespan.
Okay.
Understand?
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's incredibly important. Yeah.
It's absurd.
Mhm.
You're talking that Minnesota is in the latitude 54. My God, this is
Just
it's
above
near
45. Yeah, just above 45. I think the 45th,
45.
45.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine what is the latitude here in Chile for that would be the far south. So it must be very, very cold winters and with very little sun.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's absurd. It's absurd.
Yeah.
You will waste more energy in building, in manufacturing that solar panel, that all the energy that will produce in 25 years.
Yeah,
Just
amazing.
to-
Do you have any similar figures at all for wind turbines when you figure in all the cost of all the cement and the copper and hauling the wind turbines around? Do you get a lot more energy back after 25 years than you put into the wind turbines?
Well, it will depend on the capacity factor.
Okay, all right.
You understand? You have different, how do you say, wind. You have different winds.
Yes.
Depend where you place a wind turbine.
Mhm.
Understand?
Yep. Yes.
I understand that Germany has a very high capacity factor of wind turbines,
Okay.
while if you place them here in Santiago, you will have wind 5% of the time.
Okay. Yeah.
We
that
don't
makes
have
sense.
wind down here, so
Okay.
it depends.
Okay. All right.
But with
Good
the
to know.
solar panels, that's quite the
Yeah.
figure. Above 35 degrees latitude, you need more energy to produce a solar panel than the entire lifetime of a project.
Have you seen any claims that there are solar panels that can produce energy at night? I don't know if they're going off of moonlight or something. I've seen that claim. Have you seen it?
No, they're not called solar panels. No, using the moon, you say.
I don't know. I've seen the claim. I don't know if they're serious.
Well, it's like the theory of CO2 warming the planets. Yeah, the light of the moon, a full moon, could warm the planets.
There you go.
Okay, no. Probably what you mean is thermosolar facilities.
Okay.
And you had they all went bankrupt. And in the case of Carson Dunes in Nevada, it's not operating anymore. Yes, they are supposed to deliver electricity 24 hours a day because it's a different technology. You have a tower with a salt. That salt melts during the day because of the mirrors pointing at a heater on top, and that heats the salt, and that produces a steam necessary to generate electricity during the day. But in the night, that salt remains hot and able to generate electricity during the night. Well, that's very pretty, but in the paper, because in the actual world, they simply don't work. And there you have the biggest, the largest facility in the world that's called Ivanpah in Mojave Desert. You have 3 huge towers, and these are, I'm taking the figures from a very great presentation of this economist, North American economist.
Okay.
The best year, it had a 19% of capacity factor.
Really?
It should be close to 100 because it should produce electricity during the night. But it only had a 19% capacity factor.
Okay.
Any nuclear or coal-fired power station can exhibit an 80, 85, 90% of capacity factor. This marvels only 19. And in the case of Crescent Dunes, the best year in all its lifespan had a 13%.
Really?
And that was year 2016. And then it went bankrupt, and today it's not generating energy.
Man.
That's about 100, 200 miles from Las Vegas to the northwest, I guess.
Okay.
Crescent Dunes.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on the costs of offshore wind?
No, that's no. The only it's the same technology. I mean, it's the same type of technology than onshore wind
Okay.
turbines, but much more expensive.
Hmm.
Much more expensive
Yeah.
to get the same amount of electricity. No, that's a nonsense. That it. I don't know how to label it.
Okay. All right.
The art of destroying the economy and the grids around the world.
Okay. And then another question is tidal power. Has that ever worked anywhere?
So what?
They're trying to harness the power of the tide somehow.
Well, it's the
I don't
same
know.
principle.
Yeah.
The same principle. The tides goes. They perhaps they are more regular than wind and solar,
Yeah.
but again, you have the intermittency.
Yes. Yeah.
You can't have stable electricity as the demand demands.
Okay. All
You
right.
understand?
Yes.
So, what do you do when you have a low tide, or when you have an excess speed of the tide? The same
Yeah.
principle that what takes place with renewables. It's the same.
Okay.
You must have to back up that kind of generation. Yes, I've read a lot of articles about that. You still haven't been able to solve the problem of having a turbine deep in the water, salt water.
Hmm. Yeah.
And you see, so they have a very short lifespan, so it makes the electricity even the investment cost even greater, the capital cost. I will be watching you your next fall and winter. I hope you in the United States it will be not so critical as in Europe, I believe.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
But in Europe, they will have a very bad time.
I'm hearing that the cost of firewood is way up in Germany, and it's hard to find. Supposedly, it's hard to find a chainsaw because people are going to be cutting their own wood to try to keep their houses warm in Germany.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, that's the absurd of everything. Because if you take away the cheap gas or paraffin or fuel to heat your homes during the winter, what do poor people do? What are they going to do?
Yeah.
They want to live. They
Yes.
have the right to live. They will go to the next corner and cut the first tree they find,
Yes.
and they won't replace him by a new tree.
Hmm.
If
Exactly.
that poor person is looking how he will survive tomorrow. So that fact will cause a tremendous harm to the environment.
Yep. I
We
totally agree.
continue to increase the cost of energy around the world.
So thank you very much for being part of this.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I would like to say one of my thoughts, because I'm sure that scientists, the honest scientists around the world, have this very clear. And I would like to read you a short message for your viewers that says, goes like this: Communism found the Achilles heel of Western democracies more than 30 years ago with the melting of the Iron Curtain and the fall of the Berlin Wall, when its confinement ended and its cages were opened. Today, we're paying the consequences for having been so unsuspecting, incompetent, coward, and weak. We didn't see it coming.
Very good. Okay. So we'll end on that note.
Yeah.
We didn't see it coming. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to have you back again. Douglas Pollock. Thank you.
Okay, Tom.
All right.
It's been a pleasure.
Been a
Bye-bye.
pleasure. We'll see you later. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
All right. I'm recording again because Douglas is going to tell us how he became a climate skeptic, I believe. I'm always interested in these stories because I was saying that I used to believe in the climate scam. I know Tony Heller believed in it. Anthony Watts believed in it. But I'm interested in finding out how people switch from being believers to unbelievers. So if you wanted to go ahead and tell us, Douglas, your story.
Yes, why I used to be a believer and a supporter of climate change and global warming, anthropogenic global warming. Well, that is thanks to Al Gore. I must say, thank you, Mr. Al Gore, if you are watching this program. I'm very thankful to you because you came to Chile and you gave a speech before the, by those times, Communist President Bachelet. You must remember her. I'm talking to Al Gore, by the way, and former President Frey, Elwin, and Lagos. And you also know very well former President Lagos. He's socialist Marxist, so you must be very friend with him. When you came and gave your speech for more than an hour, and you charge $300,000 to stand before the public and the people to tell more than 50 lies, as Lord Christopher Monckton proved in his peer-reviewed paper, I was amazed. I was astonished. And I believed every single word of what he said because I am an environmentalist. I am an ecologist. I used to study ecology in school. I studied geology in the university while I was studying engineering. And I love animals, vegetation, forests, lakes, rivers, oceans, animals, and et cetera, environment in general. So when you came here and talked about climate change, I really thought that we were burning because of our fault and our emissions, the planet, but only for 7 years because I used to work in something nothing to do with the environment by those times. But there was a little noise inside my head. And in year 2013, I went for the first time to see what was all this stuff about YouTube. I have never watched anything in YouTube. I went there, and the first thing I saw there was your speech in year 2007, August, while you were being sued in the United Kingdom for the fraud of the inconvenient truth. You must remember, Mr. Gore, and you lost, and you had to pay $400,000 for the cost of the trial. While that was taking place, you were in Chile saying your beautiful speech. Now, what happened in year 2013 is that I went through your speech again, and then I said, this is the noise I was making for 7 years, and was about the ice melt and the ocean melting of the ice. And you suggested, although you didn't say it straight away, you suggest the Arctic, the North Pole would run out of ice, and then we will have the sea level rise, and millions of people around the world will have to flee and emigrate to other places. And I made that simple, what you call in mechanics, in physics, free body diagram.
Okay.
A very simple way of seeing the forces of an object and see what turns off in statics, in mechanics. And I did the calculations, and I realized that you can melt all the ice in the North Pole, and the sea level will not rise even a millimeter. You need to melt the continental ice to make the sea rise. And that is when I started to see for the first time real and honest scientists about this topic. And from year 2015, definitely I dedicate myself fully to understand in depth the science and also the economics of climate change. That's more or less the story.
Okay. That is a great story.
Thank you, Mr. Al Gore, for having me here against you this time.
Okay. Thank you, Douglas, for the encore performance there.